Alright guys, this is going to be our first video lecture for our new unit, Abolition and Division. It's going to be about the abolitionists. This isn't going to be every abolitionist that ever existed. This is going to be just who you're going to focus on for this first video presentation. Okay? Please don't forget to be taking your guided notes. They're going to help you as we progress through the unit, as well as on the quiz that's going to come at the end of this. Okay? Alright, so the abolitionists. Our first thing we're going to look at is the definition of abolitionist. Okay, an abolitionist or abolition is simply the movement to end slavery. Okay, so again, that's the movement to end slavery. All right, so abolitionists call for ending slavery. This all starts really early in American history. Before Benjamin Franklin died in 1790, he became an abolitionist himself. By 1804, most northern states had outlawed slavery. So in the North, most of the states had, they had outlawed slavery, making it illegal. And then in 1807, Congress, that's the part of the government that makes the laws, banned the importing of slaves into the United States. So you no longer have slaves being captured in Africa and brought to the United States and sold. At this point, from 1807 on, the only way slavery can continue to happen is by selling slaves to other slave owners within the United States, and then of course if slaves do have children, they become slaves themselves. So keep that in mind, guys. 1807, no longer slaves can come into the United States. The only way slavery can survive in the United States is if slaves are sold to other slave owners. Okay. All right. A few northern whites. In the North, racism still very much so exists, directed specifically towards African Americans, even in places where African Americans were free. There were a few, though. An example of this guy is William Lloyd Garrison. He was an abolitionist, and he actually published an entire newspaper dedicated to abolition, and it was called The Liberator. He did this in Boston, Massachusetts. This is in the North, and he's going to be one of those big proponents of ending slavery. Okay. Next up, we have eyewitnesses to slavery. Okay. Some of the abolitionists were former slaves themselves who had escaped to freedom. Three examples, again, this is not every abolitionist, but three examples that were former slaves themselves are Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and Harriet Tubman. We're going to talk about each of them individually. Okay? Frederick Douglass, first and foremost, he was a former slave. Douglass's courage and talent at public speaking won him a career as a lecturer for the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. So this is an escaped slave. He learned how to read and write at a very young age, and he becomes an abolitionist, and he goes around speaking for the cause to end slavery. He published an autobiography called The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, where he talks about his life growing up as a slave. And then he goes on to publish a newspaper called The North Star. He actually was really good friends with William Lloyd Garrison, one of the abolitionists we just spoke about. They had some differences in how they believed in ending slavery, and they ended up having their own separate newspapers. Next up is going to be Sojourner Truth, also a former slave. She spoke about her own experiences of slavery. She became a speaker for abolition. She drew huge crowds throughout the North. We actually saw a speech that she gave, so try and remember back to that anti-woman speech. Okay. Next up, we have the Underground Railroad. Okay, the Underground Railroad was an above series of escape routes from the north to the south. Guys, you got to remember that this is not a railroad tracks in a tunnel that went underground. This is figurative. Okay, it was above ground, and it's just a series of different escape routes from the south to the north. As you can see from the graphic, if I move my picture out of the way, you can see southern states that had slaves and slavery. These are the routes that they took to get to the north. Okay. Runaway slaves traveled on foot, wagons, boats, and trains, so pretty much any way that they could get away. They usually traveled at night and hid in places called stations. Okay, that's figurative as well. During the day, things like stables, attics, and cellars all served as stations. Alright, and then finally we have Harriet Tubman. There we go. She's an escaped slave and abolitionist, one of the most famous conductors on the Underground Railroad. A conductor, just so that we are aware, is any person who led runaway slaves to freedom. Tubman made 19 dangerous trips to free enslaved people back into the South. Some of the people that she saved were actually her parents and other family members. So there you go, guys. There's some of the main abolitionists that we're going to be looking at in this unit. Please make sure that you're aware of who they are and how they influenced the end of slavery.